So you want to own a horse racing track, build an oval, put up a grandstand, hang a few chandeliers in the clubhouse, and watch people in fancy hats hand over their money every Saturday afternoon. That's the picture in your head, the Kentucky Derby, mint juleps, a crowd roaring as thoroughbreds thunder down the final stretch. Here's the problem. The sport that picture belongs to has been quietly dying for 50 years, and the tracks that are still standing today are almost never surviving on horse racing at all. A racetrack is not really a sports business anymore. It is a gambling license wrapped in nostalgia, and increasingly, a real estate holding company that happens to still run a few races so it doesn't lose the permit that makes the whole thing legal. The moment you understand that difference, everything about how a modern racetrack makes money and how it quietly bleeds money starts to make sense. Let's start with the price list, because just like every asset we've broken down before, racetracks come in tiers, and the tier you buy into is really a different business, wearing the same silks. At the bottom sits the small regional track, the county fairground oval running a handful of race days a year, the kind of facility that can be acquired for a few $1,000,000 because the land alone is worth more than the business running on it. Above that sits the mid-sized track, running seasonal live racing over several months a year, requiring anywhere from $20 to $100 million depending on grandstand capacity, stabling infrastructure, and whether it holds a license for additional gaming. At the very top sits the marquee track, the Churchill Downs, the Santa Anitas, the Saratogas of the world, generational properties tied to a single iconic race that can be valued in the hundreds of millions to over $1 billion, not because of the horse racing itself, but because of the brand, the media rights, and the real estate underneath it. Each of these is really a different bet on the same underlying question. Are you buying a horse racing business, or are you buying a gambling license and a piece of land that happens to have a racetrack sitting on it? Now here's where the naive mental model falls apart immediately. You assume the money comes from ticket sales and betting handle on race day. It mostly doesn't anymore, and the reason is a slow-motion collapse that's been happening for half a century. In the mid-1970s, horse racing commanded the largest share of legal gambling revenue in the United States, and attendance at major tracks routinely crossed 40 and 50,000 people on a single race day. Today, total wagering on horse racing nationally has fallen dramatically, in real terms, even as the broader gambling industry has exploded, because horse racing now competes directly against state lotteries, commercial casinos, online sports betting apps, and daily fantasy sports, all of which didn't meaningfully exist as legal competitors when horse racing had the field to itself. The average age of a horse racing bettor has climbed steadily into the 50s and 60s, and the sport has struggled for decades to convert younger audiences the way sports betting apps have. Because those apps deliver instant gratification on a phone screen, while horse racing requires understanding past performance charts, post positions, and breeding lines. A genuine knowledge barrier that scares off casual bettors who'd rather just tap a parlay on a football game. So if live racing handle is shrinking, where does the actual revenue come from? The first source, and the one that's kept many tracks alive at all, is simulcast wagering, betting on races happening at other tracks around the country, and even internationally, broadcast into a track's own simulcast theater or off-track betting parlor. This turns a single physical track into a wagering hub for dozens of races a day, rather than the handful its own live season could ever offer, and simulcast handle at many tracks now dwarfs what the track's own live racing generates. The second and increasingly dominant source is what the industry calls the Racino model, and this single word explains why most surviving American racetracks still exist at all. A Racino is a racetrack that has been granted a license to operate slot machines or full casino gaming on the same property, and the revenue difference is staggering. A racetrack's own live racing might generate a few $1,000,000 a year in track-retained wagering revenue, while the slot machines sitting in the same building, sometimes in the very same grandstand that used to be filled with racing fans, can generate tens of millions of dollars annually. Tracks in states like New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia have survived specifically because state legislatures allowed them to install thousands of slot machines, with a legally mandated percentage of that gaming revenue required to flow back into purse funds, the prize money paid out to winning horse owners, effectively using casino profits to artificially prop up purses that live racing handle alone could never sustain. This creates one of the strangest structural realities in modern sports ownership. The actual horses running actual races have become, in a very real financial sense, a licensing requirement, rather than the product. Many state gaming laws explicitly tie a casino license to the track continuing to operate a minimum number of live racing days per year, which means the racing itself exists primarily to keep the much more profitable slot machines legally operating in the building. Executives inside this industry have said as much publicly for years, that without the casino revenue subsidizing purses, the live racing product in most of the country would not be financially viable on its own terms at all. The horse racing, in other words, has become the loss leader that unlocks the gambling license, not the other way around. Now let's talk about what it actually costs to run the horses themselves, because even as a subsidized loss leader, this side of the business is genuinely expensive. A racetrack has to maintain a training and racing surface, dirt or synthetic, that meets strict safety standards, with resurfacing and grading work costing hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, depending on the track's size and the material used. It has to maintain a backstretch, the dormitory-like stabling area where hundreds of horses live during a race meet, along with barns, veterinary facilities, and housing for the grooms, hot walkers, and exercise riders who work around the clock, caring for animals that can't tell anyone when something's wrong. Purse money itself is a massive fixed cost, the prize pool paid out to the top finishers in every single race, and because purses are what attract quality horses and trainers to a track in the first place, a track competing for a share of a shrinking national horse population has to keep purses competitive or watch its best horses and biggest betting days migrate to a rival track down the road offering better money. Add jockey and steward fees, drug testing and integrity programs that have grown dramatically more expensive and more strictly regulated in recent years, following a wave of safety and doping scandals. Insurance for a sport where animals occasionally suffer catastrophic injuries in full view of a grandstand and television cameras. And even a mid-sized track's annual operating costs, for the live racing side alone, can run into the tens of millions of dollars, most of it before a single dollar of wagering revenue has been counted. The safety and integrity dimension of this industry deserves its own attention because it has become one of the largest existential risks a track owner faces. Catastrophic injuries and fatalities among racehorses have drawn intense media scrutiny and animal welfare criticism for years, and a cluster of horse deaths at a single marquee track in a single season can trigger congressional hearings, state investigations, and calls for the sport's outright ban. The kind of reputational crisis that can cost a track its gaming license just as easily as a financial failure could. This led to the creation of a national anti-doping and safety authority in recent years, adding a significant new layer of compliance costs and testing requirements across the industry. Costs that smaller independent tracks have struggled to absorb even as they're mandated to comply with them. The case studies in this industry tend to fall into two categories worth understanding before anyone writes a check. The first is the track that successfully transitioned into a Racino and thrived, using casino revenue not just to survive, but to fund major capital improvements, renovated grandstands, expanded simulcast facilities, and dramatically increased purses that in turn attracted better horses and bigger betting handle in a genuine virtuous cycle, essentially proving that the casino wing and the racing wing can reinforce each other when structured correctly. The second is the track that lost its battle for relevance entirely. Historic facilities that once drew tens of thousands of fans now running meets in front of grandstands that are functionally empty except for a small core of dedicated bettors, kept alive purely by simulcast and off-track wagering revenue rather than any meaningful on-site attendance, with some historic tracks closing permanently in recent decades as their land became worth dramatically more to a real estate developer than the racing business running on it ever could be, a pattern that has quietly erased a number of storied American tracks from the map entirely, their oval infrastructure demolished for shopping centers, residential developments, or logistics warehouses. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question: how much money do you make if you do this right? In the pure racing scenario, a mid-sized track without any gaming license, relying purely on live racing handle, simulcast revenue, admission, and food and beverage sales, is likely operating on razor-thin margins or an outright loss in most years. Propped up primarily by the value of its underlying real estate, rather than its operating cash flow, the kind of asset an owner holds for land appreciation and tax reasons, rather than annual profit. In the Racino scenario, the same track holding a slot machine or full casino license can see total revenue multiply several times over, with gaming operations alone generating tens of millions of dollars in annual profit that dwarfs anything the horse racing side could produce on its own, while a mandated slice of that gaming revenue flows back into purses, keeping the racing product alive as a smaller, subsidized appendage to what is now fundamentally a casino business, with a running track attached. So if you do decide to buy a horse racing track, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you succeed. It was never really about how fast the horses run. It's about whether your state legislature lets you put a casino floor in the clubhouse. Because in the modern version of this business, the thoroughbreds are increasingly just the reason the slot machines are allowed to stay on.